Mandatory boarding schools for Indigenous children. In the 19th century, Canada established mandatory boarding schools for Indigenous children, funded by the government and run by Christian churches. Known as the Indian Residential School System, its goal was to assimilate Indigenous kids into white Canadian culture. While the intent seemed benign compared to the U.S., where Native efforts to assimilate were met with expulsion and the tragic trail of tears, the system caused lasting harm. Governmental kidnapping of Indigenous children. In the U.S., policies range from forcing Natives into impoverished reservations to outright attempts at extermination, resulting in tragic outcomes. In Canada, the residential school system forcibly removed Indigenous children from their families, placing them in boarding schools where they suffered neglect, abuse, and cruelty. Thousands died, their bodies buried in unmarked graves on school grounds. Indian residential schools. From 1863 to 1998, over 130 Indian residential schools in Canada were funded by the government, many run by Christian churches until 1969. In 1894, attendance became mandatory for Indigenous children, with boarding schools as the only option for many remote communities. Families who refused were forced to give up their children, who were then placed in these schools. Falsifying orphans' psychiatric diagnoses for profit. Du Plessis signed an order that turned Quebec's orphanages into hospitals, allowing the Catholic Church to claim higher subsidies. Over 20,000 mentally sound orphans were misdiagnosed as mentally deficient, ending their education and confining them to poorly supervised mental institutions. There, they suffered mental and physical abuse. Decades later, Quebec's government offered survivors a modest 25,000 Canadian dollar compensation, while the Catholic Church continues to dispute the claims. Transforming orphans into psychiatric patients. Maurice Du Plessis and Quebec's Catholic Church exploited Canada's federal subsidy program by misclassifying orphans as psychiatric patients. Provinces received $1 Canadian and 25 cents per orphan daily, but $2 Canadian and 75 cents per psychiatric patient. To siphon more funds, they falsely diagnosed orphans as mentally deficient, diverting federal dollars into the Catholic Church's coffers. Canadian authorities' most venal policy re vulnerable children. The Canadian authorities' handling of Indigenous and Doukhobor children was tragic. However, for sheer venality, those episodes are eclipsed by the authorities' handling of what came to be known as the Du Plessis orphans. Until the mid-20th century, the Catholic Church held significant and sometimes pernicious sway over Quebec. The 1940s and 1950s in particular were an era of widespread poverty, few social services, and church predominance. In those dark days, Maurice Du Plessis, a strict Catholic, became Premier of Quebec. He immediately proceeded to place the province's schools, orphanages, and hospitals in the hands of various Catholic religious orders. Bombing campaign in rural Canada. The violence continued, however, and culminated in a series of 259 bombings in 1962 in just one region of British Columbia. Targets included railways, power lines and stations, ferries, courthouses, hotels, and the destruction of entire villages. The authorities finally decapitated the sect in March 1962 with the arrest of 60 of its leaders, whom they charged with conspiracy to intimidate the Canadian Parliament and the legislature of British Columbia. With their leaders locked up, the remaining Doukhobors rapidly assimilated into Canadian society. Relative peace has reigned since, and Canadian spirit warrior numbers have dwindled from a peak of 40,000 in the 20th century to about 2,200 in 2011.